I spent 3 years ignoring an entire side of my property because my father always told me, son, if the sun does not hit it, do not waste your seed on it. And for a long time, I believed that. Then one summer I ran out of room in my main beds, got a little desperate, and tucked some lettuce and spinach into a strip that barely sees 2 hours of direct light. Those plants outperformed the ones baking in my full sun beds by a solid 30%. Bigger leaves, better flavor, no bolting in July. That failure to listen to my own garden instead of repeating old rules cost me years of wasted growing space. So today I'm walking you through 15 vegetables that not only tolerate shade, but actually prefer it, and in many cases will give you heavier, longer harvests than if you planted them in full sun. Now the last one on this list is the vegetable that completely rewired how I think about shade gardening. I'd been growing it wrong for over a decade before I figured out what the research was actually saying, and when I made the switch, the results were honestly embarrassing compared to what I'd been getting before. And after the main list, I have got a bonus technique for you, a simple trick involving light reflection that can boost your shade garden yields by another 15 to 20%. I stumbled onto it by accident, and I have not seen a single person talk about it. So stick around for that. Here's the principle that ties all of this together. Plants need light to photosynthesize, that is, basic biology, but not all plants need the same amount. Leafy greens, root crops, and certain fruiting vegetables evolved under forest canopies and at woodland edges where dappled light was all they ever got. Their leaf structures are literally built to capture and use low light more efficiently than a sun-loving tomato ever could. Once I understood that shade is not a disadvantage, but a different growing condition with its own set of winners, I stopped fighting my property and started working with it. So here is what actually thrives when the sun barely shows up, starting with the one I accidentally discovered on that neglected side yard. Lettuce was my gateway into shade gardening, and honestly, I feel a little foolish it took me so long. Loose leaf varieties like black-seeded Simpson and red sails are practically designed for low light. I grow mine in a bed that gets maybe 3 hours of filtered sun, and those heads stay tender and sweet well into August when my full sun lettuce has long since bolted and turned bitter. The secret is that lettuce in shade grows slower, which sounds like a bad thing, but slower growth means the leaves stay in that perfect harvesting window for weeks longer. I direct sow every 3 weeks starting in early spring, just scatter the seed about 1/4 inch deep, and I get continuous harvest from April through October in my Zone 7 garden. If you're in Zones 3 through 5, you might lose a few weeks on each end, but the shade tolerance stays the same. My father grew lettuce in full sun his entire life and threw away half of it to bitterness every summer. I wish I could go back and show him what a little shade does. Now that lettuce discovery led me straight to spinach, because if one leafy green loves shade, I figured others would too. And spinach might love it even more. Bloomsdale long-standing spinach in my north-facing bed, the one that gets about 2.5 hours of direct morning light, produces leaves that are nearly twice as thick as the same variety in my sunny raised beds. A study out of the University of Florida confirmed what I was seeing. Spinach grown in partial shade had higher concentrations of chlorophyll and certain vitamins because the plant compensates for lower light by packing more into each leaf. I plant mine about 4 inches apart in rows 6 inches wide, and I start harvesting outer leaves when they hit about 3 inches long. One planting gives me 6 to 8 weeks of steady picking. The key mistake I made early on was overwatering my shade spinach. The soil stays moist longer without direct sun beating on it, so I cut my watering back by about 1/3 compared to my full sun beds. Once I did that, the root rot problems disappeared overnight. This next one pairs perfectly with spinach because they share the same growing conditions but give you a completely different harvest. Arugula in shade is a revelation. In full sun, arugula gets so peppery so fast that half my family will not touch it. In my shady bed, the flavor stays mild and nutty for weeks, almost like a different vegetable entirely. I grow astro arugula, which matures in about 35 to 40 days, and in shade that stretches to maybe 50 days, but the leaves are larger and the texture stays tender instead of getting tough. I direct sow it thick, about 20 seeds per square foot, and thin to about 3 inches apart once they are up. The real beauty is that arugula is a cut and come again crop, so you can harvest it 3 or 4 times from one planting if you cut no lower than an inch above the soil line. If you're picking up useful tips so far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out straight talk gardening advice every single week, no fluff, no fancy gimmicks, just what actually works in real dirt. Now let me keep going because the next few are where things get really interesting. Kale is one of those vegetables that every gardening magazine tells you needs full sun, and I bought into that for years. Then I read a piece from Cornell Cooperative Extension that noted kale performs remarkably well with as little as 3 to 4 hours of sunlight per day. I tested it myself with lacinato kale, sometimes called dinosaur kale, and the shade-grown plants were more tender, less fibrous, and sweeter after light frost than anything I had grown in full sun. The trick is to give your kale slightly wider spacing in shade, about 18 inches between plants instead of the usual 12 to 15, because air circulation matters more when things dry out slowly. I lost an entire shade bed of kale to powdery mildew my second year because I packed them too tight. Lesson learned. Swiss chard surprised me more than maybe any other vegetable on this list. I'd always treated it as a sun crop. Then I stuck 3 Bright Lights chard plants into a corner that gets maybe 2 hours of direct sun in the morning, and those plants produce for 14 straight months. The stalks were thinner than my full sun chard, but the leaf size was huge, easily 8 to 10 inches across. Chard in shade just keeps going and going because it never gets that stressed, bolting signal from heat and intense light. I harvest the outer leaves once a week, always leaving at least 5 inner leaves to keep the plant photosynthesizing, and one plant gives me enough chard for 2 meals every single week. If you're in zone 7, through 10, shade-grown chard can be a true year-round crop. Now here's one that most people overlook entirely, and I almost did not include it until I saw my own results this past season. Mustard greens, specifically red giant mustard, grown in shade produce leaves that are milder and more versatile than what you get in full sun. In my experience, full sun mustard greens get so spicy they are basically inedible raw after about 4 weeks. In shade, that same variety stays salad friendly for 7 or 8 weeks. I broadcast sow the seed over a prepared bed, press it in lightly, and thin to about 6 inches apart. You can start harvesting baby greens in as little as 21 days. Beets were the vegetable that really opened my eyes to root crops in shade. Here's what I want to be straight with you about. Shade-grown beets will produce smaller roots than full sun beets. That is just the truth. But the greens, which in my opinion are the best part of the beet anyway, go. Absolutely wild in low light. I grow Detroit dark red beets in a bed with about 3 hours of sun, spacing them 2 inches apart, and the greens get so lush, I'm harvesting them like a separate salad crop while the roots slowly size up underneath. The roots end up about the size of a golf ball instead of a tennis ball, but the flavor is concentrated and incredibly sweet. My father would have said you are wasting your time on small beets, but he never tasted one pulled from a shade bed. Radishes are the speed demons of shade gardening, and this is where I need to correct a mistake I made for years. I used to think radishes needed sun to form their roots properly. Turns out, cherry bell radishes sown in a spot with 3 to 4 hours of light will mature in about 30 to 35 days compared to 25 in full sun, but the texture is crisper and they almost never go pithy or hollow. The key is not to over-fertilize with nitrogen and shade because you will get all leaf and no root. I use a light application of balanced organic fertilizer, maybe a quarter cup of 5 per 10 square feet at planting time, and that is it. This next one I discovered in an old 1970s gardening book I picked up at a yard sale for 50 cents, and it has been worth more to me than some tools I've paid good money for. Scallions, specifically evergreen hardy white scallions, are phenomenal shade performers. They do not need intense light to develop that mild, sweet flavor that makes them so useful in the kitchen. I start mine from seed indoors about 8 weeks before last frost, transplant them 3 inches apart in a bed that gets dappled sun most of the day, and they just sit there quietly growing for months. You can start pulling them at pencil thickness or let them bulk up. Either way, the shade does not slow them down much at all. Peas are a vegetable I almost did not try in shade, and I'm glad I changed my mind. Specifically, snap peas like sugar, and which is a dwarf variety that only needs about a 2-foot trellis, do surprisingly well with 4 hours of sun. The vines grow a bit lankier in shade, but the pod production was only about 15% less than my full sun peas. The trade-off is that shade-grown peas keep producing about 2 weeks longer because they are not getting hammered by heat. I plant them 1 inch deep, 2 inches apart along a simple string trellis, and I start picking at about 60 days. Now, broccoli in shade is one of those things that sounds wrong until you try it. I will admit I only tried it because I ran out of space, not because I believed it would work, and yet my shade-grown broccoli produced smaller central heads about 4 inches across instead of 6, but the side shoot production after cutting that main head went on for nearly 3 months. Green Magic broccoli was the variety that performed best for me in low light. I transplant seedlings 18 inches apart in a bed that gets about 4 hours of morning sun, and I make sure to give them a good side dressing of compost about a month after transplanting. The side shoots just keep coming as long as nighttime temperatures stay below about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Cauliflower is broccoli's pickier cousin, and I want to be honest here. Shade growing, it requires more attention, but it can be done. Snow-crowned cauliflower, which is one of the most forgiving varieties out there, will form decent heads with as little as 4 hours of sun if you keep the soil consistently moist. I'm talking about checking moisture every 2 days in shade versus every day in full sun. The heads will be smaller, maybe 4 to 5 inches across, and they take about 2 weeks longer to mature. But the flavor and texture are excellent. This is not one I would recommend for beginners in shade, but if you have a couple seasons under your belt, it is worth trying. Leaf celery, which is different from the stalk celery you see in grocery stores, is an absolute shade champion that almost nobody talks about. The variety Parcel, which is an heirloom cutting celery, thrives in as little as 2 hours of direct sun. I grow it as an herb more than a vegetable, using it to add intense celery flavor to soups and salads. It does not form those thick stalks, but the leaves are packed with more flavor than any stalk celery I have ever grown. I sow it indoors 10 weeks before last frost because the germination is slow, sometimes 20 days, and transplant seedlings 8 inches apart. One planting will last you well over a year if you keep harvesting from the outside. Now here's the one I told you about at the beginning, the vegetable that completely changed my approach to shade gardening. It is bush beans, and I know what you are thinking because I thought the same thing for over a decade. Beans need sun. Period. My father said it. Every book I read said it, and I repeated it to other gardeners like gospel. Then about 4 years ago, I was reading a research paper from Oregon State University that tested bush bean yields under varying light conditions. They found that provider bush beans grown with just 4 hours of direct sunlight produced about 70% of the yield compared to full sun plants. 70%. That is not some negligible amount. That is real food off real plants in real shade. So I tried it. I planted a double row of provider beans in my north-facing bed, seeds 1 inch deep and 4 inches apart in rows 8 inches wide, and I waited. The plants were shorter than my full sun beans by about 4 inches, but they set pods steadily for 6 weeks. I harvested just over 3 pounds from a 4-foot row. Not a record breaker, but 3 pounds of fresh green beans from a spot I'd written off as useless for over 10 years. That is what changed everything for me. It made me realize that yield reduction in shade is not failure. It is a trade-off and a very reasonable one when the alternative is growing nothing at all in that space. Since that first trial, I have tested 4 other bush bean varieties in that bed. Contender and Jade performed nearly as well as Provider. Royal Burgundy struggled a bit more, dropping closer to 50% yields. But the principle held. Bush beans do not need full sun to give you a real harvest. And if you have shade space sitting empty, you are leaving food on the table. That old rule about beans needing full sun. It is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. And incomplete advice is almost as bad as wrong advice. Now let me run through a few common mistakes I see and that I made myself for years when it comes to shade gardening. The first is treating shade like a problem instead of a growing condition. I used to look at my shady areas and feel defeated. The better approach is to match your crop to your light, just like you match your crop to your soil and your season. The second mistake is overwatering shade beds. I drown more plants than I care to admit before I realized that less sun means less evaporation, means less water needed. Cut your watering frequency by about 1/3 compared to full sun beds, and check soil moisture at 2 inches deep before you water. The third mistake is using the same fertilizing schedule as your full sun garden. Plants in shade grow slower and use fewer nutrients. I over-fertilized my shade lettuce one year with a heavy nitrogen feed and got leggy, bitter plants that bolted early anyway. Cut your fertilizer rates in half for shade crops, and you will be in much better shape. The fourth one, and this is the mistake that cost me the most time, is giving up on a shade spot after one bad season. I had a terrible first year with my north bed. Terrible. I almost paved it over, but I adjusted my varieties, fixed my watering, and the second season was one of the most productive beds in my entire garden. Now here's that bonus technique I promised you. I discovered this by pure accident when I leaned a piece of white foam board against my fence while cleaning up the garage. It sat there for a week right next to my shade bed, and I noticed the lettuce nearest to it was growing noticeably faster and more upright than the rest. What happened was the white surface was reflecting ambient light back onto the plants. And after seeing that, I went out and bought 2 4x8-foot sheets of white corrugated plastic, the kind you can get at any home improvement store for about $10 each, and I positioned them on the north side of my shade beds, angled slightly toward the plants. The difference was measurable. I did a little experiment with 2 identical plantings of spinach, one with a reflective panel and one without, and the reflected bed produced about 18% more by weight over a 6-week harvest period. The leaves were also slightly darker green, which tells me they were photosynthesizing more efficiently. You do not need anything fancy. A white painted board, a piece of foil-faced insulation, even a light-colored fence will help. The key is placing the reflective surface on the side opposite from where the light is coming from, so it bounces back into the bed rather than away from it. Simple, cheap, and genuinely effective. If any of this was helpful, and I hope it was, go ahead and subscribe for more straight talk gardening advice. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which of these shade vegetables you're going to try first, or if you have already been growing something in shade that I did not mention, share it so everyone can benefit. That is how we all get better at this. I started this video telling you I wasted 3 years of growing space because I believe shade meant nothing would grow. 15 vegetables and 1 bonus trick later, I hope you see what I finally learned the hard way. Shade is not wasted space, it is opportunity. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next one.